The air in the great hall was old. It was a cold, settled age, thick with the dust of centuries and the sweet, metallic tang of spilled wine that was older than the trees in the royal gardens. It clung to the velvet draperies that swallowed the light and lay like a shroud over the long, black marble of the feasting table. For the 100th guest, it was an atmosphere of intoxicating power. For Elara, it was just the air she breathed, the medium through which she moved, silent and unseen. She was a ghost in a grey dress, her footsteps lost in the resonant hush between pronouncements, her existence measured in the emptying and refilling of crystal goblets. Invisibility was a skill she had perfected. It was in the lowering of her eyes, the quiet efficiency of her hands, the way she could glide between the high-backed chairs of the courtiers without so much as stirring the air. They were creatures of terrible and beautiful stillness, these vampires of the Onyx Court, and to draw their attention was to risk being pinned by it, examined, and discarded. Elara had seen it happen. A serving boy who tripped, a girl who laughed too loudly. They were simply gone the next day. And so she learned to be nothing, a pair of hands, a function. Tonight, the king was in a particularly glacial mood. King Caitian sat at the head of the table, a figure carved from obsidian and moonlight. He was not moving, had not moved for the better part of an hour, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the mullioned windows where a perpetual, unnatural twilight reigned. His stillness was a warning, a pressure in the room that made the others hold their breath. His beauty was a weapon, sharp-boned and severe, framed by hair the color of a raven's wing. It was a face that had not known warmth in 1,000 years. When his gaze did move, it was with a predator's slow, deliberate languor, and it promised nothing but ruin. Elara was clearing plates from the far end of the table, her focus narrowed to the task, the weight of the porcelain, the smear of blood-rare meat. It was this narrow focus that allowed her to see what no one else did. Lord Vorlag, a duke with eyes like chips of flint and a smile that never reached them, was presenting the king with a gift. It was a ceremonial decanter, ancient and exquisite, wrought of hammered silver and set with a single, enormous ruby that pulsed like a captive heart. It was meant to hold the evening's centerpiece, a vintage of blood so rare it was spoken of in whispers. The court murmured its approval. The craftsmanship was undeniable. The gesture, one of profound loyalty. Caitian's eyes flickered toward it, a flicker of interest that was more terrifying than his rage. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Lord Vorlag's smile widened, a brief, predatory flash of white. But Elara saw the flaw. It was not in the silverwork, nor in the cut of the gem. As Lord Vorlag tipped the decanter to pour the rubidark liquid into the king's personal chalice, a chalice of pure, unadorned obsidian, Elara saw the light catch it. On the lip of the spout, almost invisible against the gleam of the metal, was a tracery. A fine, dust-like powder that shimmered with a faint, sickly green luminescence, no brighter than the phosphorescence on a decaying log. It was gone in an instant, washed away by the tide of crimson liquid, but she had seen it. Her heart, a frantic, foolishly mortal thing, began to hammer against her ribs. Silver was an irritant to the old blood, an annoyance. But there were legends, kitchen whispers, tales of alchemies that could turn the metal into a virulent poison, something that didn't kill but incapacitated. Something that could bring a god to his knees. The faint green shimmer spoke to her of those forbidden chemistries. She stood frozen, a heavy plate in her hands. The king's chalice was full. Lord Vorlag was bowing, retreating into the ranks of the sycophants. The king's long, pale fingers reached for the stem of the cup. The entire world seemed to shrink to that single, impending gesture. The space between his fingertips and the cold obsidian. A breath. A heartbeat. A lifetime. Her invisibility, her shield, was suddenly a cage. To speak was to be seen. To be seen was to die. But to remain silent, to watch him lift that cup, was a horror of a different kind. It was not loyalty that moved her. She felt no loyalty to the cold, cruel monarch who ruled their lives with casual disdain. It was something else, something more elemental. A horror at the quiet, treacherous violence of it. The sight of a life, even one as remote and terrible as his, about to be extinguished by a lie. Her own life was a small, fragile thing, a candle flame in a hurricane. His was a star, cold and distant, but a star nonetheless. And she could not stand by and watch it fall. The plate in her hands trembled. The decision was a physical thing, a lurch in her gut, a tightening in her chest that stole her breath. She set the plate down on a nearby sideboard, the clatter of it unnaturally loud in the sudden, sharp focus of her senses. The sound was a period at the end of a sentence, the final word in the long, silent argument she had waged with herself. She was going to do it. She was going to walk across that endless expanse of polished marble. She was going to step out of the shadows and into the lethal, consuming light of the throne. The journey from the edge of the hall to the foot of the dais was the longest of her life. Each step was a conscious, deliberate act of will, a battle against the screaming instinct to turn and flee back into the comfortable anonymity of the shadows. The floor was a mirror of black marble, reflecting the vaulted ceiling and the cold, unblinking light of the enchanted chandeliers. It felt like walking on a frozen lake, the ice groaning beneath her feet, threatening to give way and plunge her into the abyss. With every footfall, the ambient murmur of the court seemed to die away. First, the courtiers nearest her fell silent, their heads turning, their ancient, predatory eyes fixing upon her. The silence spread like a ripple, a stain of stillness moving through the hall, until the only sound was the soft scuff of her worn leather shoes against the stone. She could feel their gazes on her, hundreds of them, a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. They were not curious. They were confused, then annoyed, then hostile. A servant did not walk to the king. A servant did not exist in the center of the room. She kept her own eyes down, fixed on the path ahead, not daring to look at the faces that turned to watch her. She could feel their judgment, their contempt for this disruption, this bizarre breach of an etiquette as old and rigid as the castle walls. Her grey dress, a garment of practical, humble wool, felt like a beggar's rags in this sea of velvet and silk. Her hands, calloused from work, were balled into fists at her sides, the knuckles white. The dais was 3 shallow steps up, each one a mountain. She could smell the king now, a scent of cold stone, night air, and something else, something ancient and indescribable, like dry papyrus and faded roses. It was the scent of time itself. She stopped at the bottom step, her head bowed, her heart a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She did not know the protocol. She did not know the words. She only knew the image of the green dust, the terrible certainty of what it meant. Silence. A vast, echoing chasm of it. It stretched for an eternity. She could hear her own blood roaring in her ears. Finally, a voice, not the king's, but his chamberlain, a desiccated vampire named Valerus, spoke. His tone was like the crack of a whip. What is the meaning of this? You will state your purpose and be gone. Ilara swallowed, her throat dry as dust. She had no voice. Not in the way they understood it. She had been born into a world of silence, her vocal cords still and useless. Her language was in her hands, a flurry of motion that most here would not, could not, understand. She had to try. She lifted her head, her gaze sweeping past the chamberlain to land on the king. And she froze. To meet Caitian's eyes was to look into the void between stars. They were a deep, fathomless violet, utterly devoid of warmth or light, and they held the chilling, passionless curiosity of a scientist observing an insect. There was no anger in them, not yet. Only a profound, ancient boredom, momentarily disrupted. He did not see a person. He saw a thing that was out of place. He leaned forward slightly, his chin resting on a steeple of his long, elegant fingers. The movement was mesmerizing, a serpent's uncoiling. Let her, the king's voice was a low, resonant murmur, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very stones of the floor. It was a beautiful voice, hypnotic and deadly. I am intrigued. What could possibly compel a mouse to approach a dragon? A ripple of cruel, low laughter went through the court. Ilara took a shaky breath. She lifted her hands. The gesture felt clumsy, obscene in the face of their lethal grace. She began to sign, her motions sharp with urgency, desperate to be understood. The decanter. Lord Vorlag. It is tainted. She formed the signs for poison, for silver, for danger, her fingers flying in the silent air. It was a frantic, desperate dance, a story told in a language of ghosts. The king watched, his head tilted. A slow, languid smile touched his lips, a masterpiece of condescending amusement. It did not reach his eyes. He did not understand the words, but he understood the performance. He saw a servant, a low-born human, gesticulating wildly, breaking the serene and ordered perfection of his court. He saw madness, or a pathetic attempt at gaining attention. "What is this puppet show?" he asked the room at large, his voice dripping with disdain. Valerus, the chamberlain, stepped forward. "Your Majesty, she is defective. A mute." This is her crude attempt at speech. The word defective was delivered with a casual cruelty that made Alara's stomach clench. Caitian's smile widened. "Ah." A broken toy. He turned his full attention back to Alara, his violet eyes pinning her in place. "And what is the broken toy trying to say?" "Dance for us, little mouse. What is so important that you would risk being swept away with the rest off trash?" Tears of frustration and terror pricked at Alara's eyes. She shook her head, signing again, more slowly this time, pointing from the decanter to the king's chalice, making the sign for death, a sharp, downward slash of her hand. "Danger. Do not drink. Please." Her expression was a mask of pleading, her body rigid with the effort of conveying the truth. The king let out a soft, breathy laugh. It was a terrible sound, colder than a winter grave. He picked up the obsidian chalice, swirling the dark liquid within. The gesture was a deliberate mockery of her warning. "She seems to think my wine is not to my liking," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "A connoisseur, are we? Tell me, what is your expert opinion? Is the vintage too bold? Not enough notes of terror and despair?" The court erupted in sycophantic laughter, a chorus of polite, vicious amusement. Alara felt her hope shrivel and die. He wasn't listening. He was performing, using her as a prop in his theater of cruelty. He saw her desperation not as a warning, but as entertainment. She was a diversion in his endless, boring night. He lifted the cup higher, a toast to her. To the serving girl, he announced, his voice ringing with theatrical irony, whose discerning palate has saved us all from a terrible fate. He held her gaze, a silent challenge, a final, crushing dismissal of her and her frantic, silent words. He was showing her exactly what he thought of her warning, of her life. His cruelty was an art form, perfected over a millennium. It was not the hot, messy anger of a mortal man. It was a cold, deliberate, and exquisitely refined sadism. He did not simply dismiss her, he vivisected her, laying her bare and insignificant before the entire court. He held the chalice to his lips, his eyes still locked on hers, and in them, she saw the vast, empty expanse of his immortality, a wasteland of boredom where a moment's entertainment was worth more than a human life. He wanted her to watch. He wanted her to see her warning turn to ash, to understand the sheer, unbridgeable distance between them. She dropped her hands to her sides, defeated. The strength that had carried her across the floor evaporated, leaving her hollow and trembling. A profound sense of failure washed over her, cold and bitter. She had stepped out of the shadows only to be blinded by a light that did not warm, but incinerated. She had tried to stop a star from falling and had only succeeded in getting herself burned. He drank. A single, deliberate swallow. His throat worked, a pale column of marble. He lowered the cup, placing it back on the table with a soft, definitive click. The smile remained on his lips, a mask of triumph. He had proven his point. He was a king. A god. And she was nothing. "See," he murmured, his voice a silken thread of contempt. "Perfectly safe." He gestured with a flick of his fingers. "Remove it." Two guards stepped forward, their faces impassive. They took her arms in iron grips, their touch cold even through the wool of her dress. They began to drag her away, back toward the obscurity from which she had come. The eyes of the court followed her, filled with pity and scorn. She was a fool, a broken thing that had dared to imagine it mattered. As they pulled her away, she kept her eyes on the king, a final, desperate plea. But he had already looked away, his attention drifting back to the mindless adulation of his subjects, her interruption already forgotten. She was less than a memory. She was a moment static, now gone. Alara was not taken to the dungeons. That would have been too direct, too much of an acknowledgement. Instead, the guards deposited her back in the servants' corridor, a long, stone passageway that ran behind the great hall like a secret artery. The dismissal was absolute. She was not a prisoner, she was merely refuse, returned to the pile. She collapsed against the cold stone wall, the rough surface scraping her back, and slid to the floor. The sounds of the feast, muffled by the thick walls, returned to her ears, the distant murmur of conversation, the faint clink of crystal. Life in the hall was going on, utterly unchanged. She wrapped her arms around her knees, trying to stop the violent trembling that racked her body. Humiliation burned in her chest, a hot, acidic shame. She had been so certain. The green shimmer, the unnatural stillness of Lord Vorlag's hands as he poured. It was real. She knew it was real. But the king had drunk, and he was fine. He had looked at her with those ancient, violet eyes and shown her that her reality did not matter. Only his did. Had she imagined it? Had the strain of this life, the constant fear and vigilance, finally fractured her mind? The thought was a new kind of terror. Perhaps this was how it happened. You saw shadows where there were none, and in your madness, you reached for a king and were swatted away like a fly. Time stretched, losing its shape in the dim, torchlit corridor. She didn't know how long she sat there, lost in a fog of shame and doubt. It might have been minutes or an hour. The world had narrowed to the rough stone beneath her fingers and the frantic, unsteady rhythm of her own breathing. Then, a sound cut through the muffled din from the hall. It was not a loud sound, but it was sharp, unnatural. A gasp. Not of pleasure or surprise, but of sharp, collective shock. It was followed by a sudden, absolute silence. The murmuring stopped. The clinking of glasses ceased. It was as if the entire great hall had, in a single instant, held its breath. Ilara's head shot up. The silence was more terrifying than any scream. It was a void, a vacuum where life and sound had just been. It was wrong. Another sound broke the stillness, the harsh, scraping sound of a chair being pushed back violently. A clatter of falling silver. A choked cry. She scrambled to her feet, her own fear forgotten, replaced by a cold, prickling dread. She knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that she had not been wrong. The poison was not fast. It was slow. Insidious. It had waited, lurking in the king's immortal blood, until it had found its purchase. She crept to the servants' door, a small, arched opening covered by a heavy tapestry. Her hand trembled as she pushed the coarse fabric aside, just enough to peer into the hall. The scene was a tableau of frozen horror. Every courtier was on their feet, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. And at the head of the table, King Caitian was, falling. It was not the quick, sudden collapse of a mortal. It was a slow, hideously graceful descent, as if he were moving through water. His body had gone rigid, his back arched. The obsidian chalice had slipped from his grasp and lay shattered on the floor, a splash of dark wine spreading like blood across the marble. His hands were clawed, his jaw locked, and his eyes, those fathomless violet eyes, were wide with a surprise so profound it bordered on agony. He was not dying. He was being unmade. And then she saw them. 3 figures moving through the frozen crowd. Lord Vorlag was one of them. The other 2 were his sons, broad-shouldered vampires with the same flinty eyes as their father. They moved with a purpose that was terrifying in the stillness, their expressions grim and triumphant. They were not rushing. They didn't need to. The king was helpless, a statue of imminent collapse, pinned in the final moment before he hit the floor. This was not just an assassination. It was a coup. The royal guard, stationed at the main doors, were just beginning to react, their training warring with the sheer shock of what they were witnessing. They were drawing their swords, shouting commands that seemed to get lost in the heavy, silent air. But they were too far away. Vorlag and his sons were already closing in on the dais, their own blades drawn, the steel gleaming like captured starlight. Ilara's mind raced. The poison. The green shimmer. Silver. But not just silver. Alchemically treated silver, designed to paralyze, to turn an immortal's strength against him, to make him a helpless vessel of his own power. But all alchemy had a counter. Every poison had an antidote, Or at least a neutralizer. Kitchen whispers came back to her, the folklore of the human servants, the things they said when the masters weren't listening. Tales of what could ward off the lesser evils, what could soothe the bloodthirst, what could break a curse. Salt. Common, mundane rock salt, used to cure meat and scrub floors. It was said to disrupt weak enchantments. And iron. The touch of pure, unadulterated iron was said to burn the old blood, to cause a violent, purifying reaction. Her eyes darted around the edge of the room. On the sideboard where she had left the plates, there was a large, ornate salt cellar, a heavy silver dish filled with coarse crystals. Beside it, a set of iron-handled serving implements, tongs, and knives for carving the great roasts. There was no time for a plan. There was only instinct, a desperate, kinetic surge of it. The guards were still fighting their way through the paralyzed crowd. Vorlag was at the foot of the dais, raising his sword for a final, declarative strike. The king was still falling, his eyes locked on the ceiling, a prisoner in his own body. Ilara burst from behind the tapestry. She was a grey blur of motion. She did not run toward the king. She ran to the sideboard. She didn't grab the salt cellar. She upended it, sweeping the entire contents into the wide, shallow serving tray she had been carrying earlier. With her other hand, she snatched the heaviest of the iron-carving knives. And then she ran. She ran toward the center of the storm, toward the dais, toward the collapsing god and the men who meant to kill him. She was a mouse running at dragons, just as he had said. But a mouse can move where a dragon cannot. She slipped between two stunned courtiers, her shoulder bumping a man in rich velvet who didn't even seem to notice. Vorlag saw her. His eyes widened for a fraction of a second in disbelief. A servant. This insignificant mute. He snarled, dismissing her as a gnat, and turned his attention back to the king. That fraction of a second was all she needed. She didn't try to fight him. She didn't try to stop him. She threw the tray. With all the strength in her body, she flung the silver platter like a discus. It sailed through the air, a spinning disc of metal, shedding a cloud of white crystals. The salt. It wasn't aimed at Vorlag, but at the king. The cloud of salt washed over Caitian's rigid form just as his back hit the cold marble of the dais. At the same instant, Ilara, still stumbling forward from the force of her throw, did the only other thing she could think to do. As she passed the king's fallen body, she reached out with the iron-carving knife. She didn't stab. She didn't cut. She pressed the flat of the cold, mundane iron blade against the exposed skin of his wrist. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The moment the iron touched his skin, a scream tore from the king's throat. It was not a sound of pain, but of pure, unrestrained power being released. A wave of force, visible as a shimmer in the air, erupted from his body, throwing Ilara backward as if she'd been struck by lightning. She landed hard on the floor 10 feet away, the breath knocked from her lungs, the iron knife skittering away into the darkness. The same wave of force hit Vorlag and his sons. They were thrown back like dolls, their bodies tumbling through the air to crash into the main feasting table, shattering wood and crystal. The salt, which had settled over the king like a fine white dust, began to glow with a fierce blue light where it touched his skin, and the rigid paralysis that had held him broke. He gasped, a deep, shuddering intake of air, and pushed himself up onto one elbow, his body still trembling with the aftershocks of the poison and its violent cure. His eyes, no longer wide with shock, were now blazing with a violet fire of pure, undiluted rage. The hall erupted into chaos. The royal guard, finally free of the spell of inaction, surged forward, their swords flashing as they fell upon Vorlag's dazed and injured sons. Courtiers screamed and scrambled away from the dais, their carefully constructed facades of grace and power shattering into raw, primal fear. The coup was over. The rebellion had lasted less than a minute. In the center of it all, Ilara lay on the floor, gasping for air, her vision swimming. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was the king's face. He was looking at her, past the guards, past the chaos, past the body of Lord Vorlag who was now trying to crawl away. He was looking directly at her. And in his eyes, she saw something that terrified her more than his cruelty or his rage. It was a look of raw, utter confusion. The look of a god who had just witnessed an impossibility. The world returned to her in pieces. First came the cold, a deep, seeping chill that seemed to emanate from the stone beneath her. Then came the silence, a heavy, oppressive quiet that felt different from the hush of the great hall. This was the silence of confinement. She opened her eyes. She was in a small, windowless room, the walls and floor hewn from the same grey, unforgiving stone. A single torch sputtered in a sconce on the wall, casting long, dancing shadows. She was lying on a narrow cot, a rough wool blanket her only comfort. She pushed herself up, her muscles aching as if she'd been beaten. Her head throbbed. The door, a heavy slab of iron-banded oak, was shut fast. There was no handle on her side. A cell. After everything, this was her reward. She was a prisoner. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the fog of her exhaustion. She had not been hailed as a hero. She had not been thanked. She had been locked away. She was a loose thread, a complication in the official narrative that would soon be woven around the night's events. Lord Vorlag's treachery would be the story. The king's strength in overcoming it would be the moral. The serving girl who had thrown salt. She would be edited out, erased. And the easiest way to erase someone was to make them disappear for good. Days bled into one another. Or perhaps it was only hours. In the windowless room, time had no meaning. Twice, a slot in the door opened and a tray was pushed through, a piece of dry bread, a cup of water. No one spoke. No one looked at her. She was a thing being kept, not a person being held. In the long stretches of silence, she replayed the events in her mind. The look on the king's face. The shock. The confusion. He had seen her. For the first time, he had truly seen her. And it had apparently terrified him enough to lock her away in the heart of the mountain upon which his castle was built. She thought he would have her killed. It was the logical, sensible thing to do. She knew his weakness. She had seen him brought low. Such knowledge was a threat, and Cation did not suffer threats to live. Every time she heard footsteps in the corridor outside, her heart would leap into her throat, a frantic bird convinced the executioner had finally come. But the final, fatal footstep never came. On what she guessed was the third day, the sound that reached her was different. It was the heavy, grinding sound of the lock being turned. The iron bolts screamed in protest as they were drawn back. The door swung inward, flooding the small cell with the brighter torchlight of the hallway. Valerus, the chamberlain, stood in the doorway. His desiccated face was as impassive as ever, but his eyes, small and dark, held a flicker of something she couldn't name. It wasn't hostility. It was appraisal. "The king will see you," he said, his voice dry as autumn leaves. The guards who had escorted her before were behind him. Their grips were firm as they led her from the cell, but there was a new quality to their touch. It was not the rough handling of a prisoner, but the careful, almost cautious handling of something fragile and unpredictable. As they walked through the winding stone corridors, servants and courtiers they passed would press themselves against the walls, their eyes wide, their gazes a mixture of fear and awe. She was no longer invisible. She was a spectacle. A legend whispered in the shadows. The mute who saved the king. They did not take her to the throne room. They led her up a winding staircase, into the king's private wing, a part of the castle she had never seen. Here, the oppressive grandeur of the public spaces gave way to a more austere, personal kind of power. The walls were lined with books, thousands of them, their leather spines dark and silent. The air smelled of old paper and beeswax. She was brought to a halt before a set of tall, intricately carved wooden doors. Valerus pushed them open and gestured for her to enter. The guards remained outside. She was to face him alone. The room was a study. A fire burned in a vast hearth, its warm light a startling contrast to the cold luminescence that filled the rest of the castle. Cation was not on a throne. He was standing by a tall, arched window, looking out into the perpetual twilight. He was dressed not in formal court attire, but in a simple, dark tunic and trousers. He looked younger, somehow, and more real. But the power radiating from him was undiminished. If anything, it was more potent here, in his own space. He did not turn when she entered. He spoke to her reflection in the dark glass of the window. They tell me the official story is that I was seized by a momentary affliction, a passing weakness, which I cast off with my own indomitable will. Lord Vorlag, in his madness, mistook this for an opportunity and was summarily executed for his treason. His entire line has been extinguished. He paused, letting the finality of that statement hang in the air. It is a neat, tidy story. It preserves the illusion of my invincibility, an illusion upon which this entire kingdom is built. He turned then, slowly, and his violet eyes found hers. The cold amusement was gone. The theatrical cruelty was gone. In its place was a raw, unnerving intensity. He looked tired. It was a shocking thought. A being as old as mountains, looking bone-weary. But you and I, he continued, his voice low, we know the truth. Don't we? Ilara stood frozen, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She could only nod, a small, jerky movement. He took a step toward her. I have spent the last 3 days replaying that moment. My own arrogance. My stupidity, he said the word as if it were a foreign object in his mouth, distasteful and sharp. I mocked you. I used you for sport. I sent you away to what I assumed would be your death at the hands of my guards, for the crime of annoying me. And then you saved my life. He stopped, standing only a few feet from her. He was so tall. He seemed to pull all the light in the room toward him. The castle is buzzing with stories about you. They say you are an enchantress, a holy woman, a witch who cast a spell. They do not understand what they saw. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. But I do. I saw a servant with a tray of salt and a carving knife. I saw common kitchen remedies wielded against an alchemical poison that should have held me paralyzed for an hour. Tell me, how did you know? This was the question. The pivot upon which her life now turned. She took a breath and lifted her hands. She had to make him understand. She signed slowly, carefully, her motions clear and deliberate in the firelight. Kitchen stories. The servants' talk. Old wives' tales about iron and salt. I did not know it would work. I only hoped. He watched her hands, his brow furrowed in concentration. He did not understand the language, but he seemed to be trying to decipher the intent, the shape of the meaning. It was the first time anyone in this castle had ever truly tried to watch what she had to say. You hoped, he repeated, the words a soft exhalation. He looked from her hands to her face. You hoped. After what I did to you. After I held you up to the ridicule of my entire court. After I drank the poison specifically to prove you a fool. You still chose to save me. He shook his head, a slow, bewildered movement. I have lived for more than 2,000 years. I have seen empires rise and fall like the tide. I understand greed, ambition, lust, hatred, and fear. They are the engines of the world. But I do not understand that. I do not understand you. He took another step, closing the distance between them. He was so close now she could feel a strange cold radiating from his body. He lifted a hand, his long, pale fingers reaching toward her face. She flinched, a small, involuntary recoil. His hand stopped, hovering in the air between them. Why? He asked, and the single word was not a king's demand, but a genuine, aching question. It was the most vulnerable sound she had ever heard him make. Ilara looked into his eyes, into the violet depths that held millennia of loneliness and power. And for the first time, she did not feel fear. She felt a strange, unexpected pang of pity. She lifted her own hands one last time, and her answer was as simple and as honest as the act itself had been. It was not for you, she signed. To stand by and watch a life be taken by treachery, any life, is a greater poison. I did it for myself. To not become a monster like them. She held his gaze, letting him see the truth of it in her face. It had not been an act of love or loyalty. It had been an act of self-preservation, of preserving the small, fragile core of her own humanity in a place that sought to crush it. A long silence followed. He stared at her, his expression unreadable. The fire crackled in the hearth. He slowly lowered his hand. He looked, undone. As if her simple, selfish honesty had struck a deeper blow than any poison or sword. He, a king who commanded legions and lived outside the bounds of mortality, had been saved by a principle he could barely comprehend, from a girl he had considered less than dust. "I see," he said, though it was clear he did not. "Not yet." He turned and walked back to the window, his back to her. "You are no longer a servant. You will have chambers in this wing. You will be given anything you require. You are under my protection." He spoke the words to the glass, to the endless night outside. It was not a reward. It was a decree. A statement of a new, bewildering reality. "You are a complication I must now study." He did not dismiss her. He simply stood there, a dark silhouette against the window, leaving her alone in the vast, quiet room, a prisoner of a different, more gilded, and infinitely more dangerous kind. The weeks that followed were a study in dislocation. Ilara was moved from her cell to a suite of rooms that were larger than the entire servants' quarters she had once called home. The bed was piled high with silks and furs, the furniture was carved from dark, polished wood, and the single window looked out over the silent, moon-drenched royal gardens. She was given dresses of velvet and brocade in shades of deep blue and forest green, fabrics so fine she was almost afraid to touch them. Food was brought to her on silver trays by servants who would not meet her eyes, who would set down the dishes and scurry away as if she were a ghost. She was a curiosity. A protected anomaly. She was no longer Ilara, the mute serving girl. She was the king's savior, the king's folly, the king's something. No one was quite sure what. And in this new, gilded cage, she was more isolated than she had ever been in the crowded, noisy world of the servants. Before, she had been invisible. Now, she was watched. Always watched. Caitian kept his word. She was under his protection, a protection that felt more like possession. He did not summon her again in those first few weeks, but she felt his presence everywhere. It was in the unnatural silence of the guards outside her door, in the quality of the wine left for her each evening, in the single, perfect white rose that appeared on her vanity each morning, its petals impossibly pristine, untouched by dew or decay. Her life became a quiet routine of waiting. She would read from the books in her room, histories, poetry, tales of lands she would never see. She would walk in the gardens, a silent, grey figure moving among the silent, silver-barked trees and the night-blooming flowers that tracked the moon across the sky. The court, when she glimpsed it from a distance, treated her with a wide, fearful berth. She had become a symbol of the king's power, a reminder that he could elevate the lowest of the low, and that he could see things they could not. They did not know the truth that he had been blind, and she had been the one to see. One evening, nearly a month after the night of the failed coup, there was a knock on her door. Not the timid rap of a servant, but a firm, authoritative sound. When she opened it, Valerus the chamberlain stood there. Behind him stood a small, elderly human man with kind eyes and ink stains on his fingers. "The king has sent a tutor for you," Valerus announced, his tone flat. Ilara tilted her head, confused. A tutor? For what? She could read and write perfectly well, a skill her mother had insisted upon before she had been sold into service at the castle. She made a questioning gesture. The old man stepped forward, bowing slightly. "My name is Alaric, my lady. His Majesty has commanded that I am to learn your language, and that I am to teach it to him." Ilara stared, stunned into stillness. He was going to learn to speak to her. Not through an interpreter, not through the clumsy medium of pen and paper, but in her own native tongue. The language of her hands. The thought was so audacious, so profoundly unexpected, that she felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. For this king, to humble himself as a student, to learn the silent dialect of a defective servant, it was an act that defied comprehension. It was more intimate and more terrifying than any gift of jewels or silks. It was an attempt to cross the unbridgeable gulf between them. And so the lessons began. Every afternoon, Alaric would come to her rooms. He was a patient and gentle teacher. He explained that he was the royal archivist, a scholar who had spent his life studying dead languages from forgotten empires. To him, her sign language was not a disability, it was a living, breathing piece of history, a language of immense grace and complexity. At first, she taught him simple things. The signs for book, table, Moon he was a quick study, his scholar's mind adept at memorizing the shapes and movements. But as they progressed, the lessons became more difficult. He struggled with the nuance, the way a slight change in expression or the speed of a gesture could alter the entire meaning of a sentence. It is not just a language of the hands, he murmured one afternoon, flexing his own stiff fingers. It is a language of the entire body, of the face, of the eyes. It requires an emotional honesty that writing does not. A week into their lessons, the king began to join them. He would enter the room silently and take a seat in a high-backed chair by the fire, simply watching. He never spoke. He just watched, his violet eyes fixed on their hands, on Alara's face as she formed the signs, on Alaric's clumsy attempts to mimic them. His presence changed the very air in the room, charging it with a heavy, unspoken tension. Alara found herself fumbling her signs, her hands suddenly clumsy and self-conscious under his intense, analytical gaze. He was not just observing. He was studying. He was dissecting her language, and by extension, her. He was trying to solve the puzzle she presented, the equation that did not balance in his ordered, logical world. Why had she saved him? The question still hung between them, unanswered in any way he could truly understand. One evening, after Alaric had departed, Cation remained. The fire had burned down to embers, and the room was filled with shadows. He rose from his chair and walked toward her. He stopped a few feet away, just as he had before. He lifted his hands. They were long, pale, and impossibly graceful. And he began to sign. His movements were hesitant, awkward, the signs of a beginner. But they were clear. Teach me. It was not a command. It was a request. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. She looked at his hands, then at his face. His expression was severe, concentrated, the look of a man attempting a task of immense and frustrating difficulty. There was no mockery in it. No condescension. Only a raw, determined effort. She nodded slowly. Taking a deep breath, she lifted her own hands and began the first lesson. She started with the simplest sign she could think of. The sign forehand. She held up her own, palm flat. Then she guided his hand, her warm, mortal fingers briefly closing over his cold, immortal ones, to form the same shape. His skin was smooth and cool as marble. The touch was brief, professional, but it sent a jolt through her, a spark of connection so unexpected it almost made her pull away. He learned quickly. His mind, ancient and vast, absorbed the information with an unnerving speed. What took Alaric a week to master, Cation learned in a day. He was a demanding student, not of her, but of himself. He would practice a single gesture for an hour, until it was perfect, until the flow and shape of it were exact. Their lessons became the new rhythm of their lives. They spent hours together in the firelit study, the world outside falling away, leaving only the two of them and the silent, growing vocabulary that moved between them. He learned the signs for king and castle, for night and star, and she, in turn, began to see the man behind the monarch. She saw his frustration when he couldn't master a complex phrase. She saw the flicker of triumph in his eyes when a sign finally clicked into place. She saw the profound, aching loneliness that was the true foundation of his cruelty. He had spent millennia being listened to, obeyed, and feared. But he had never, she realized, truly had a conversation. He had never had to do the work of understanding another person. The power dynamic between them began to shift in subtle, seismic ways. In that room, she was the teacher and he was the student. She was the master of a language he desperately wanted to learn. She held a power he could not command or take, it could only be given, and only earned through patience and effort. One night, they were practicing phrases. He signed to her, his movements still stiff but becoming more fluid with each passing day. "The sky is cold tonight." It was a simple observation, a sentence from their lessons. But it was more than that. It was the first time he had initiated a thought, shared an observation that was not a question or a demand. It was the beginning of a conversation. Ilara felt a strange warmth spread through her chest. She looked past him, through the tall window at the star-dusted darkness. Then she looked back at him and her hands moved, the signs flowing with a grace he could not yet match. "Yes," she signed, her expression soft. But the stars are bright. He watched her hands, and then his eyes met hers. And for the first time, in the depths of those ancient, violet eyes, she saw not a king, not a predator, not a god. She saw a flicker of something else. A dawning comprehension. A fragile, terrifying spark of connection. The vast, cold distance between them was still there, an ocean of time and blood and power. But he had just taken the first, clumsy step onto a bridge of his own making. The final image that held in the quiet room was of their hands, frozen for a moment in the space between them, one pale and ancient, the other mortal and warm, having spoken, and having, however briefly, been understood. And in that shared silence, a new world, dangerous and uncertain, had just begun.